Hey, just to let you know, this video is in 60 FPS, and since we'll be talking about frame rates and comparing them, make sure your YouTube quality is set to a 60 FPS option. As we all know, the world has been inundated with gaming content, and one of the biggest components of that is the ability to capture footage from game consoles. And as someone who's been around on the internet for a long time, I've seen it all. Camcorder Let's Plays, the original PCI capture cards, USB devices like the Dazzle, DVD recorders and DVRs, the I never knew how to pronounce that, HD PVRs, and of course, the more recent, extremely popular Elgato devices. Yes, these devices, often still called capture cards despite no longer being cards, have been instrumental to the online content revolution. I too have been using a selection of Elgato devices for the past 5 to 6 years, and while plenty of competitors have cropped up since, these still seem to have the market dominance. Which is not to say that they're perfect, the hardware and software can be pretty glitchy, and as someone who records a lot of retro consoles, Elgato no longer supports any products with a wide range of analog inputs. They have the video capture, but it lacks any component or HDMI and is pretty specifically designed for digitizing VHS rather than recording or streaming gameplay. For over 6 years now, I've been primarily using the original Elgato Game Capture HD released in 2012, which supports composite, S-Video, component, and HDMI, but is no longer supported and hasn't received a driver update since 2016. Elgato is gradually removing mentions of it on their website, and you get the distinct impression that while you can still use it with their software today, you may not in the foreseeable future. Since the drivers are completely proprietary and non-generic, and have only been partially reverse engineered as of this video, when they stop working, the device will essentially become a paperweight. So I've started to look into alternatives. Elgato themselves recommend basic analog to digital converters, and there are of course high-end upscalers and line doublers like the OSSC and RetroTink. But an all-in-one capture device would definitely still be most convenient, so when Cloner Alliance reached out about sending me one of their capture devices to review with plenty of analog inputs available, I was genuinely interested in how it performed. Particularly because it even had VGA, which I have wished I could capture before from things like the Ultimate Windows 98 PC. Even some consoles like the Dreamcast can output VGA, which is widely considered the cleanest output you can get out of it without installing an HDMI mod. It does lack S-Video though, which I do think is a bit of a drawback. Another potentially interesting feature though was that it could record on its own to a USB device, while most capture devices need a computer attached. I did always find it strange that the HD PVR needed a computer despite being called a PVR. So they sent me a unit and it arrived extremely quickly. Literally within a day it was here, so I certainly can't complain about the shipping times. Since I had an Xbox set up at the time, I connected it up with Component and tested it out. Something kind of funny is that even for the analog adapter they're using an HDMI connector. No, this is not how HDMI works, but you can of course repurpose a connector for other things if you really want, like wiring a COM port into a Guitar Hero controller. Just don't expect to use this adapter anywhere else or to plug any real HDMI into this port. While this may be a little more confusing for users than having a whole different type of plug, I kind of get it from an engineering standpoint. If you're already buying a bunch of HDMI connectors for a product, it's always cheaper to just buy more of them than have to get a bunch of a whole other connector too. Now before we go any further, let me take a moment to pay some bills and thank the sponsor of this video, NordVPN. As a power user, I always like to have a VPN on standby, and NordVPN is one of the biggest and best. NordVPN has over 5,400 servers in 60 countries, and according to AV-Test, NordVPN is second to none in performance and speed. If you need to bypass a geo-block, NordVPN is an excellent way to do it. If some show or other content is only available in another country, it only takes a few clicks to look like you're in that country too, making that show or content magically available. I even used it recently to make an account on a website that only lets you make one if your IP address is in Japan. Region locking sucks, but it doesn't have to be a showstopper. NordVPN also provides a password manager called NordPass. Password managers are widely considered the most secure way to use passwords on the internet. They let you have a different password for every account you have without having to memorize each one yourself. And what that means is that if one of those websites gets hacked and its password database gets leaked, which happens pretty often unfortunately, none of your other accounts are compromised and you can just regenerate a new password for that website and all your accounts will be secure again. For all this and more, check out nordvpn.com/mattkc. It's risk-free with their 30-day money-back guarantee. And now back to the capture card. Anyways, with my Xbox connected through Component and the device connected to a monitor with HDMI, I started playing, what else? Burnout 3. And I immediately noticed an issue. The frame rate was not 60 FPS. If you're not familiar with capture devices, it's common for them to have what's called a pass-through, which means it outputs an exact copy of the video coming into it that you can then plug into a TV or monitor. This used to be a necessity with older devices like my Game Capture HD because they would introduce a significant amount of latency to the capture feed, making games unplayable with the computer alone. So to solve that, you have a no latency pass-through, which ideally should have a feed that's as good as if the device wasn't there at all. So the fact that this has affected the frame rate means it kind of fails at being a true pass-through. It may be hard to see on the camera footage, so take a look at it slowed down. Ignoring the motion blur from the camera, the picture only updates every second frame. Or does it? Upon further inspection, occasionally the device does manage a 60 FPS output. I haven't figured out why or when, but essentially sometimes it can manage 60, but most of the time it looks like it's 30, which makes me think it's actually a bug of some kind. In fact, after noticing this, I got in touch with Cloner Alliance support, and they don't seem to be aware of any 30 FPS limit, so I'm pretty confident this is a bug, or maybe something specific to my setup, or potentially even just a bad unit. Admittedly, Burnout is a particularly unforgiving example because it's specifically designed to run at 60 FPS as much as possible. 30 FPS games like the original Xbox release of Halo are pretty much indistinguishable from how they usually look. Except that there are also a few frames of latency, another thing that disqualifies this from being a true pass-through. It isn't massive, but it is there, and I did notice it while playing. I counted about 4 frames, or roughly a 15th of a second. For reference, here's the latency compared to my Elgato pass-through. In fairness, this probably isn't intended to be a true pass-through. It has an on-screen display and menu, so it's definitely processing the video at least a little bit, rather than just passing it through. And that's fine, it doesn't have to be a pass-through, but plenty of people will need a no-latency 60 FPS feed, and seemingly the only way to achieve that with this device is with extra video duplication hardware. Well, my next question was, did it record in 32? Thankfully no, recordings are all smooth and consistent, even at 1080p. But wait, this isn't a 1080p game, the device just upscaled it to 1080p on its own. It turns out this device only supports recording in 4 resolutions, 1920 by 1080, 1280 by 1024, 1280 by 720, and 1024 by 768. Yeah, weirdly it doesn't support recording natively in 480i or P, despite one of its selling points being support for analog standard definition video. This might not bother some people, I mean, chances are the footage will end up in a 1080p or 720p sequence anyway, but I like having my recordings as untouched as possible, or at least having the option. This becomes especially strange with the device's VGA input. PCs can obviously have extremely variable resolutions, and while I don't necessarily expect a capture device to be able to support every single one, I do expect it to at least support all of the resolutions it claims to. Weirdly, the device does not report 1080p or 720p as a supported resolution to the computer, so there are actually only 2 resolutions you can get native recordings for, 1280 by 1024 and 1024 by 768. Once again, I really just wish it had some kind of 480 recording mode. It would benefit not just standard definition, but also a lot of VGA usage too, and the fact that it doesn't is sadly kind of a deal breaker for me. The manual doesn't help either. It actually says the device can support 720 by 480 on one page, and then contradicts itself later by only mentioning the 4 we've already discussed. But I will admit the capture actually does look pretty good if you can match the resolutions. The image is crisp, the frame rate is smooth, and the sound is pretty good too.
This guy moaned at least this loud. Oh!
There are perhaps a few more compression artifacts than I'd like at the high bitrate setting, but it's hardly a deal breaker, especially for gameplay. There is another problem though. For some reason, the on-screen display gets baked into the recordings. It shows up every time the resolution changes and then eventually disappears after a few seconds. I can see how this might be useful for some recordings to know what the resolutions were, but I generally prefer my recordings without it, and no, there is no option for it, which was confirmed by Cloner Alliance support. Okay, so far we've been covering the device's self-recording, but this thing can also connect to a PC and function as a peripheral capture device. The company's software, known as Cloner Alliance Helper, is a pretty standard recording application. So standard that, unlike Elgato's capture software, which is exclusively for Elgato devices, it actually records any video or audio device available on your system. I discovered this the hard way because the first time I launched it, it crashed, and then crashed again, and again. Turns out it was actually just defaulting to one of my Elgato devices, a device whose drivers, as I've said before, can be a little bit buggy. So while you could argue a Cloner Alliance application should probably try to default to Cloner Alliance devices, I think this is mostly still an L for Elgato. An Elgato, if you will. You can actually buy Cloner Alliance Helper on its own for $60, so maybe they do see it as a generic recording app, even though I can't personally see why you'd use it over the plethora of free and open source recording programs. But in a way, all of this genericness may be the Box Pro's biggest strength. Think about it. The software isn't doing anything special or proprietary, and I didn't even have to install any drivers for this to be picked up, not just in the app, but system-wide. Yeah, the device is, in fact, completely plug and play on all major platforms including macOS and Linux, addressing my biggest pet peeve with Elgato, that their sometimes buggy software is completely closed and proprietary. The software does claim to provide more resolution options than the hardware itself, and technically it does. However, it turns out it's still capturing at those same resolutions mentioned earlier, and just stretching the video again, making the image quality even worse. It seems to me that the capture resolution you choose is the internal resolution that the device works in at all times. All video will get scaled up or down to that resolution, and all that Cloner Alliance Helper can do is resize it further after the fact. Here's a comparison zoomed in. When the resolutions match, we get nice crisp pixels, but when they don't, it gets blurred, and rescaling it with Cloner Alliance Helper just compounds the problem. I think this really demonstrates why native resolution recording is important and why it's such a shame that the device doesn't support many of them. Almost all scaling operations are effectively a generational loss of quality. There's also even more latency on PC, so you definitely need that HDMI output, even though, as we've discussed, it isn't free of latency either. I estimate it's about half a second's worth, which is still at least better than the Game Capture HD, but yeah, definitely no instant game view or anything like that. Here's something interesting. According to the app, we're only getting between 30 and 32 FPS here, and it certainly does look like it, but I wonder if that's related to the 30-ish FPS we get on the HDMI output. When recording, the app does claim it's at 60 FPS, but it's actually just baking the same 30 FPS stream into a 60 FPS video. Or worse, when you select constant FPS, it just doubles the speed of the video to turn that 30 into 60, which is basically useless. This sadly means that PC recordings are actually inferior to internal recordings, because the internal recordings have always managed to be 60 FPS. I will mention once again that Cloner Alliance claims to not be aware of any 30 FPS limits, so this could just be an isolated issue somehow, but I haven't found any way to solve it as of this video. How about streaming with OBS? As you'd expect, this works pretty much identically to the app. Same inconsistent frame rate, latency, and all. It's kind of a shame about the frame rate, because this is the one time I wouldn't really mind the lack of resolution options, because yeah, it's all going to get scaled to one resolution eventually with no pampering in between. But no smooth 60 FPS kinda ruins it. And yes, the on-screen display is here too, so that will end up having to be part of your broadcasts. So what do I think? Would I recommend the Cloner Alliance Box Pro to anyone? Well, there are some things I like a lot. I think the VGA is useful for me. I think the fact that it can record on its own without having to set up a laptop or anything as well is pretty convenient, and I like that it's driverless and is plug and play on all platforms. If your resolutions all match, I think the internal recordings do look pretty decent. While the compression quality could be better, they definitely do in a pinch if you need to record something quickly but don't want to set up a whole computer in the process. Basically, I think it shows a lot of promise. There are just too many deal breakers for me to use it as my main device. I obviously don't like the lack of recording resolutions, specifically having no 480 modes. I don't like how there's effectively no zero latency 60 FPS pass-through available, or how it bakes the on-screen display into recordings and streams. And for it to be the ultimate device, I do kind of wish it had an S-video input too. So will it become my main capture device? No, but with some firmware updates and further hardware revisions, maybe it could someday. You could definitely do worse, but considering it's not much cheaper than an Elgato HD60S Plus, and considerably more expensive than a secondhand Game Capture HD, you could also definitely do better. Anyways, thank you all for watching, thanks to Cloner Alliance for sending me one of these units, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye guys.
Subscribe to NAC KC.